Greetings, dear viewer, and welcome to Purposes Crossed, where I hope that people who are called by Jesus for different purposes cross paths and exchange ideas. In this video, we continue with our series of devotions on the Psalms, and today we are dealing with Psalm 13. Now, Psalm 13 is a short psalm, but it has many elements that we find in many other psalms. The superscription identifies it as a psalm of David, but gives no further information about the circumstances surrounding its composition. Because the context is unknown to us, we are able to see relevance to our lives quite easily. However, we must be a little cautious and not blindly apply the psalm to our lives. For when David mentions enemies in the psalm, he most likely meant real people who were out to get him. David is very honest in the psalm and asks God why he had hidden himself from David and how long this hiddenness would last. Now, all of us experience times when, despite our faithfulness, despite our desperate clutching at God, God Himself seems distant and aloof. For many of us, these periods have stretched on for years, and some even decades. Some of us live with life threatening illnesses, congenital diseases, and chronic infirmities. Some are born into situations in which they are exiles and refugees. Now, we will never be able to measure the amount or depths of suffering in the world, but we know in our bones that something is amiss. Something tells us that this is not how things were meant to be. But in the midst of this life, which exposes us to all kinds of suffering, how do we continue living? What allows us to face tomorrow, even though yesterday and today were filled with the pain, the likes of which we cannot even begin to fathom, let alone explain? Here, David provides us with an answer. Verses 5 and 6 describe a situation after God delivered him, and David looks back on that period of despair and reflects on it. And if anyone were to ask him, how did you get through that period of dark despair? He would point to God's unfailing and steadfast love. If there is something we really need in our lives, it is an unbreakable, unshakable trust in God's faithfulness. You see, if we truly believe that God has our best interests in mind, we would not despair when faced with insurmountably difficult situations. We would rather expect that He would come through for us, despite the appearances to the contrary. But this does not mean either that we will not face difficult times or that God will always restore us to the life we had before this disaster struck us and entered into our lives. Rather, Psalm 13 shows us that God does not spare His people from the pain and suffering that others experience. Indeed, if we are to develop the kind of compassion that God has for His creations and for His creatures, we need to experience what others experience. Only then can we truly empathize with others and express our solidarity with them by being moved to act out of a deep compassion for them in their situations. Now, we must not think that God's faithfulness means that He will pull us out of all the situations no matter what. That is just magic masquerading as faith. For if God would spare our lives through just about any situation, then we really do not face any risk from any decision that we take. However, people who do not expect risks are likely to be rash and make poor choices just because they stand to lose nothing. This produces a situation in which character cannot be developed because it does not promote the acceptance and bearing of responsibilities. In other words, if we believe we have a charmed life in which we risk nothing, we remain immature. The Bible teaches us that Jesus learned how to be obedient through His sufferings. The scriptures tell us that His sufferings enabled Him to develop and display character beyond any other person, a character completely accepted by the Father. Now, if Jesus Himself had to suffer to develop His character, we cannot think that we can mature into persons with character without having to endure sufferings. David and we live on different sides of Jesus. He did not have the understanding that we now do. From his perspective, unmerited suffering was something that those who are faithful to God should not have to endure. However, we know that the only person who was completely faithful to God suffered immeasurable pain and died a cruel, unjust death. We recognize that unmerited sufferings are a part of the life of faith, and they do not indicate a failing either on our part or God's. Nevertheless, it is still right for us to pray as David did. asking God to take the suffering away from us, relying solely on the faithful character of God, even though from the life of Jesus we understand that God can use our sufferings to produce character and maturity. This is the tension in which we must exercise and express our faith. God's faithfulness cannot be questioned, but God's faithfulness does not mean that He will step into every difficult situation we face and rescue us from it. And hence, the fact that we suffer greatly does not mean that God has turned His face from us and rejected us. Our sufferings rather produce the environment within which God provides us with the opportunity to become mature humans like Jesus who went before us.